Hi, everyone. Welcome to the OnPoint podcast. Today, I had Michael Kahn, a Senior Director of Medical Affairs Operations at Spark Therapeutics, join me on the show. We got to discuss the evolving role of medical operational and excellence positions within medical affairs and the importance of process improvement and strategic planning to drive success. You're really going to enjoy hearing Michael's perspective on these different roles within medical excellence. Welcome to OnPoint, the Medical Excellence podcast, where we talk to pharma leaders about how to build highly effective medical affairs organizations. Hello, and welcome to the OnPoint podcast. I am so excited to have Michael Kahn here as our guest today. Michael is not your ordinary medical affairs leader coming from an educational background in journalism, operational excellence, and becoming a certified medical publications professional and earning his MBA. With over 20 years in medical communications, Michael transitioned into a leadership role within medical operations, where he has been instrumental in integrating strategic and operational excellence into medical affairs. His contributions have significantly enhanced the strategic planning process, financial management across 7 medical cost centers, technology implementations, process improvements, all within medical affairs. If you haven't had a chance to work with Michael or talk with Michael, his role is so dynamic, and so is he. He's always evolving to meet these very diverse needs within medical operations and medical excellence, serving informally as the chief of staff to the head of medical affairs when required, really demonstrating a versatility and dedication that was essential to driving success across various capacities. Michael, I am so glad to have you, my friend, on the podcast, and this is going to be a lot of fun.
It really is, Scott, and I am thrilled to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Awesome. Well, let's just maybe start, because not everybody who's listening knows Michael Kahn. So maybe you could just start giving us just a little background about your role and how you kind of moved into this space of operational excellence and leadership within medical.
Sure thing. And operations in medical affairs, I think, is a relatively new capability. When I first landed in medical affairs within pharma back in 2007, I wasn't aware of any other operations excellence groups in the industry, and my company at the time, Shire, certainly didn't have one. So I have a medical communications background, and I have an educational background, as you said, in journalism. And so I landed after college at a small medical publisher doing medical editing for medical marketing materials and handbook. And that's where I really learned firsthand about the entire medical affairs, medical communications, infrastructure, industry, economy. And so I moved up through different agencies and went into account direction and with publications, and eventually went client side, and I started leading publication teams. I went to Spark Therapeutics, a gene therapy biotech in Philadelphia in 2015 for a very exciting opportunity to build out their medical communications function as the third person in the entire medical affairs department. And as the company grew, it became very clear that there was an operations excellence capability that was really needed. There was really a gap there. And so I volunteered for it, developed a job description in partnership with my boss, and started to develop an operations team and leverage that cross-functional medical communications experience into overall operations excellence for Spark. And I've been doing that at Spark since 2018.
Given your background, when you first got into medical affairs, did you find that you were thinking about things differently and seeing things differently than like everybody else around you?
A little bit. And I think that's always been the case even before I got into medical affairs. In college, in internships, I always had an eye toward process. How do we do work? What are the obstacles that are getting in our way? How can teams do things better? And I remember even in my first job out of college, and this was way before SharePoint and file shares, email was pretty new, hard copy memos were still a little bit of the norm. And so we were editing manuscript on hard copy with handwriting, right? And so version control, how you think about that was very complicated. You'd end up with folders this. And my mind instantly went to, how do you manage that? And how do you track changes? And I informally developed a system with our project coordinator to improve that. And so from a very early time in my career, I was attuned to process improvement. How do we do things better? As I developed my career into medical affairs, I've just taken that with me. And now that in operations excellence, I think it's a natural fit. It's really plays to my strengths.
I think back to my very first interaction with medical affairs. My first client was Biogen, and I got called in for a week to help a team of MSLs, didn't know what those were, engage with KOLs, didn't know what those were, and like, what are all the processes? And so I met this team 15 years ago, and I was like, wow, these folks are extremely smart. They're extremely passionate about something bigger than themselves and the commercial goals of their organization. And they're really bad at the things I'm really good at. Like, what a fit. I'm so glad you found it.
Yeah. And so often in operations, it's about filling those gaps and those unmet needs within the organization, about doing things well that professionals who are trained in medical affairs, medically trained, don't get training in project management, in organizational design, in effectiveness, right? And so being able to translate business to scientific professional and the converse, being able to translate science to business professionals is a very effective overall skill set for an operations professional.
Absolutely love it. Well, let's jump into some details here. So, you've used a number of words, even in our introduction here, to describe medical operation, medical excellence. Some teams even have like a chief of staff. And I know you've kind of informally played that role sometimes. What's the difference? So, maybe like walk us through what operations and excellence is and what are kind of these different roles that you're seeing within the industry.
Sure. And I think that's an important question because it drives the perceptions of the activities of what the individuals on the team and what the team's accountabilities truly are. What are their success factors? I think there's a lot of overlap between those descriptors, certainly more overlap than less, but the way a group or an individual is labeled can contribute a disproportionate amount to their ability to influence without authority in an organization, which is really key to success in this role. So I will go over some of the perceptional differences that I see. So if you start with chief of staff, that is a single role and connotes an individual leader and not a team. Sometimes a chief of staff has direct reports, but often it's a role that requires direct influence without authority because the principal, the C-suite, usually executive that the chief of staff reports to, has those direct reports, and the chief of staff is the chief, but doesn't have direct line authority. So it's a catch-all, right? There are often relatively few boundaries of the activities of a chief of staff. Anything that comes across the principal's desk that requires organizational input and management and approach really will lead to the chief of staff to determine how that gets done. It's a centralized authority, but that needs to be earned. And so it's really more focused on executing the agenda of the principal rather than the agenda of the team. But we obviously hope that those two are absolutely aligned in any organization. Certainly when you have a conflicting agenda of a leader and team members, that's an underlying problem, right?
Got it.
So medical excellence, that implies to me that a team is adding value outside medical affairs. So if you think of the other core functions in a pharmaceutical or biotech environment, commercial, regulatory, compliance, and legal, I expect medical excellence to truly be adding value and organizing the overall deliverables of medical affairs to expand beyond and manage cross-functionally, right? A couple of examples of that, founding on insights, right? How do you communicate insights through an organization rather than keeping them within medical? How do you manage KOL relationships across an organization, not just within medical? How do you integrate strategic planning with other functions? Those are all those key cross-functional initiatives of medical excellence. And then operations, I perceive as more internally focused to medical affairs, but I think they're similar activities.
Mm-hmm. As organizations grow and change over time, I tend to see these evolve. right? And I'd love to see if you see the same pattern or if you see a different pattern. But like, I think most teams will eventually start an operations group and take some of the daily running of the business, whether it's managing grants, managing systems, managing reporting and analytics, maybe even pulling in some centralized SciComm function. But eventually they try to take that off of the individual TAs, centralize it so that we have synergy, people doing similar work, common platforms, common ways of doing things. But it becomes like, this is us doing that thing. And then eventually, because these guys get good at processes and systems and technology, at some point, this medical excellence function kind of gets built within it that isn't necessarily always facing this group. It's going back into the broader organization on becoming the machine that builds that machine, right? It's how do we operate better? And eventually that becomes spun off. So now you have people who follow the playbook and you have people who build the playbooks. And then eventually it seems like coming later is this chief of staff role, because there's so much going on here now. And there's so much interaction and coordination and budgets and planning that has to occur that the leader can't do it all. Even though most organizations expect that they can, they need somebody to be the one helping them maximize their performance, their time. How do you see that evolving? Like, but that's how I see it.
I think operations in most, if not all organizations, medical affairs organizations, scientific organizations, operations is the last function to be built out. You're starting in a startup kind of environment or a small pharma kind of environment. You got to get the work done. And there's very little role for overseers, integrators. I'll talk more about that in a minute, right? And to your point, I do think those pockets of excellence start to develop within organizations. And then when the organization determines that it needs to develop a centralized capability, they can pluck from different areas if they're fortunate enough to have professionals who are already strong in those areas, or they might need to go outside if they've determined they have a lot of functional expertise, but not a lot of organizational business acumen within that medical. So in developing previous operations groups, we've looked both internally and externally, and some of the key areas that we've gone to both sections inside the organization and outside the organization. Project management can come from either. I think I look for integrators. I look for people who can see that bigger picture of how different functions really contribute to different deliverables and how can they facilitate conversations and activities that really speed through those collaborations and get over those humps.
Yeah.
Financial management, strategic planning, process improvement, those can come from within the organization. They can come from externally to the organization. But to your point, I do agree that operations is probably the last piece to be built out. I also think about technology, right? And so the intersections among tools and processes, which I could go on for days about, and I know you can too, and particularly with regard to field medical teams, how can you optimize CRM? How can you optimize an insight system? To be able to see the big picture about that, the different functions and the different steps in a process, as I think about it, those are skills that in my experience have usually come from outside the organization because they are niche skills, but I think they're truly some of the most valuable all of medical affairs, because I always talk about insights as the currency of medical affairs. It's a very impactful deliverable, and to be able to optimize that insights process and communication is really powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the skills that you talked about this function or these people having is now, how do you then take those and actually ensure that they're not wasted, right? You do all this work on the insights, but do they ever get acted on, right? We just talked with another person. There was a McKinsey article that came out this past year that said less than 1% of insights are ever read by their medical organizations. So what a waste, right? And it's amazing. If you have a 30-person MSL team, okay, and based on current average salaries, average support costs for that team, if you ask that team to spend third of their time for 1 quarter focused on a specific topic, that's $1 million decision.
Mhm.
Right? Nobody even realizes that they made it. It's amazing.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point. How much resources truly spent on it when you look at it that way.
Yeah. So, Michael, this role is often very difficult to explain internally to the organization. Never mind to your friends and neighbors who go, I still have no idea what you do. Our organization, our team learned something that we call the perfect intro, which is instead of saying, I am a medical excellence person, I'm a medical operation, I'm a chief of staff, like, because those don't mean a lot to people who don't know them. We start with, I help, and then you insert who you help and then what you help them with. So, like, my intro is that I help medical excellence teams build highly effective medical affairs organizations. What would your perfect intro be in this role?
What a great question. And I like the construct of who do you help, because that's incredibly illustrative to somebody who needs to see the benefit and not just the day-to-day activity, right? The impact. So I would say our medical operations or our medical excellence function integrates core medical functions in the day-to-day work. They want to remove their obstacles and improve their quality. And to talk about those benefits, removing obstacles and improve quality, that resonates probably more so than we develop project plans, we communicate status, snore, right? But at the end of the day, what's the benefit to the organization?
So I love that intro. And it leads to a really important question to any org design. How do you measure the success of a team or a person in this type of role? And maybe it's a little bit different for operations versus excellence, but holistically start and then maybe go into some of the nuances.
Well, that's a great question. And as our audience very likely knows, capturing useful metrics in medical affairs is a long-standing question in this industry. And it's something I'll start by saying we have not solved this as an industry. I want to start from that. That said, it is important to put something on the board as a measure of success and think about continuous improvement in those metrics, and we will get better at it. So when I think about the success of operations, my first look is to the medical affairs organization as a whole, because the success of medical affairs as a whole is the success of operations.
Mm-hmm.
So many companies have stated core values of collaboration, of respect that apply to how do we do the work and not just the results that you achieve. And so when a team member is looking at how to develop an effective key performance indicator, KPI, to a core value, I think about those process values about collaboration and respect, because I think effective KPIs can be developed there. If I'm talking to a current or a prospective medical affairs operations professional, I'll say, collect specific examples of feedback. An email saying, thanks, this insight report is extremely effective, or we could not have developed this advisory board without you. Collect as many examples in writing, orally, capture a note, and eventually you should have a library of them, be able to capture that at least semi-quantitatively or encapsulate it in a report for executives to look at and start to appreciate what medical excellence and or medical operations can really bring to the table.
It seems the reason, going back to like why teams start a operations function to begin with, right, is they're taking fairly standard repeatable processes out of individual TAs so that they can get really good at that process and then find new ones to do that with. And so I love your thoughts on things like one great measure I find for operations is efficiency, right? So for example, I worked with a team a couple of weeks ago where they were arguing, should MSLs have 30 interactions or 32? I'm like, I don't care. Like that doesn't really matter. What I want to know, because I actually don't know for every team how much of that is helpful, but I do want to know how many could you do? Like if that's all you were doing, is your team capable of meeting with 3 thought leaders a day if that's all you were doing? And is there a way we could get that to 4? through technology or process or better improvement. Now, you might not choose to use that new capacity for more thought leader engagement. You might use it to do HCP education programs, or you could use it to just reduce the burden because people feel overworked today, whatever it is. But that's how I really like to look. What could you do? And I think living in the could is really important for the operations and excellence teams.
Yeah, it's about removing obstacles, right? What's getting in the way, even if it's not obvious, and even if it's a marginal improvement, if it's still one of the most impactful improvements you can do within your organization, do it. Another example I just thought of, at Spark, medical affairs operations has process responsibility for the medical, legal, regulatory review of scientific material. And we undertook a comprehensive process improvement around that. And so how do you develop metrics around that? Interestingly, a few of the metrics that we saw definitely improve, we measured, and we had to build systems to do this, we measured the number of days it took for a project to get from initial submission to all the way to the end. So how long does it take to get a project done? If you can eliminate one review because you can improve the process, that's significant. And so we saw that happen. We also saw a drop in the number of expedited reviews because we were able to really communicate the process to content owners and explain the importance of avoiding an expedited review for all the obvious reasons, workload and risk management. If a reviewer is crunched for time, they're more likely to miss something. And so our expedited reviews came down. And so I think of that, not to toot my own horn, but to talk about metrics for operations that clearly show benefit.
Absolutely. Well, hey, to use your language right there, sometimes if we don't toot our own horn, there is no music. As a leader of a function, because how big is your operations excellence team that you lead?
Project managers, medical legal review coordinators, finance and contracting, and technology.
Toot your own horn, Michael. I think that's one of the top roles of a leader of one of these functions, is to be playing the music and sharing the successes of the team. And you've got so much to brag about now. And I think that you're picking the right things to talk about, right? I think where people get in trouble for, quote, tooting their own horn is when they start playing music that doesn't make sense to anybody. And it's not actually talking about the benefit that they're having.
Well, thanks, Scott.
There's a lot of folks that listen that I get to talk to, so I know they're listening to this, who are kind of new into one of these roles. They're either the first medical excellence person, or maybe they came in to a medical excellence group that was disjointed, but now they're bringing those people together. So they have technology and training and project management kind of coming together for the first time. What are some of the biggest challenges that a medical excellence leader will have when they first get into those roles?
That's a great question. And I think about a classic Harvard Business School book called The First 90 Days, which is really a blueprint for immediate impact in an organization. And I highly recommend it to anybody at any level of their career. I think the advice is really spot on.
Put a link to that in the show notes, everyone.
Oh, great. Thanks. So when I think about what those challenges are, my knee-jerk response, the first thing I think of is that is going to be highly specific to the organization, where the organization is in its evolution of medical affairs, where those pockets of excellence sit. Do they sit anywhere, or do they need to be brought in externally? And what are the problems? What are the pain points of the processes that medical affairs undergoes on a day-to-day basis? Those can really differ, right? And we've talked about some of them, but I think effectively diagnosing those is the first role of a leader. And so to do that, I think it's really critical to gain and maintain internal credibility. Having the idea of open ears and closed mouth and talking to as many people as possible in order to build those networks and gain that credibility. So you're not coming in immediately with action, but you're looking to diagnose what the issues are, will make you ultimately much more credible and effective than coming in and saying, I know this way works, we're going to do it this way. That's number one.
Okay.
Number two, aligning the approach with the company and department culture. What is the culture of the department? What's the culture of the company? And by culture, I mean those sets of behaviors that really influence how the work is done. So are communications informal? Somebody walks down the hall and knocks on the door and there's a conversation. Is it a group email? Is it a post on Teams? How do communications really happen? How are decisions made? Are they made kind of in the meeting before the meeting where consensus is built and then everybody comes to the meeting and that kind of ratify what was done informally? Or the alternative to that is, are meetings true dialogues with different points of view celebrated and thought given right there and a decision either made or reflected on? Those are two different ways of doing it. Procedure, is the organization very procedure driven strictly? Here's the way we do it step by step. Or is there an emphasis on being nimble, being agile, being creative? And where's that boundary? So that's what I mean by culture, and really paying careful attention to, and then identifying where the centers of influence in the organization really live. I talked about this a little bit before, but it's more than just building stakeholder engagements. It's about determining who in the organization is really important to get on your side. Because if you're going to be a change manager, and ultimately that's what a new operations excellence leader is, they're a change manager. They're eventually going to bring change to the organization within and external to medical affairs. You need to identify who you really need on your side and work with them. I like to approach these people and say, I would like to partner with you on this initiative because it benefits you this way. Ba-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. Not about me, not about my agenda coming in. I've come in and I've seen, hey, I'm thinking about this. It affects you. Here's a win for you.
Love it. Michael, as you were saying that at the end, when these medical excellence functions mature and get big, I often start working with them because now they want to add more capabilities to their team. And one of the symptoms I see from teams that didn't start where you just talked about is they don't have internal champions for their work. And this is what that sounds like. I've sat through big POA meetings where the head of medical gets up and says, everybody, I want to introduce you to our head of medical excellence. They're making us do this. Right? They're going to share with us their KPIs for you.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to share with us the new tool that they're making you use so that we can do X, Y, and Z, right? Versus, hey guys, I'm really excited about something that I think is important and I've asked for help. And I'm going to talk to you about why we're doing this and what it is. And they're going to show us how. But like that disconnect, whenever I hear a leader say, MedX is making us do this, like, they didn't start right.
100%. 100%.
So, Michael, if you were going to hire medical excellence people, it might be the first person on the team, it might be the 10th person on the team. What are the capabilities and traits that you're looking for to put on that team to make sure that the way they go about their work, not just what work they do, but the way they go about it, overcoming some of those challenges, build champions in the organizations, become a catalyst for making the organization better than it was, and being able to do it in a way that they can scale and actually do in the long term?
That's a fantastic question. So if I think about what success looks like, what we just spoke about for a new leader, a leader can be anywhere in the organization. To achieve that internal credibility and that identification of culture, I want to see curiosity. I want to see openness. I am very interested in the questions they ask in the interview. They are to me almost as, or sometimes more important than the questions I ask them. I want to see that engagement and curiosity because I know that will translate to that stakeholder engagement, that they will ask questions of my peers and be able to do that diagnosis. I want to see good listening. To your point, any behaviors in an interview that suggests to me that somebody is prescriptive in their approach, agenda bound, I think that's a little bit of a red flag. The one exception to that might be, emphasis on might, an internal candidate who is already aware of the problems, but that's a limited scenario, and I would still want to see that curiosity.
Well, they should be able to explain it then, right?
Yes.
They were curious.
Perfect. Exactly. You still want to see that curiosity mapped to, I was curious, so I found this, and here's what I see. And that's very effective. Sure.
Right.
The other thing I want to see is adaptability of a communication style, because I think that's so important to change management and personal effectiveness. When I think about what professionals on my team do I want to interview a prospective candidate, I want very different interviewing style, because I want to see how they perform with different people and different styles. And I want to see them flex a little bit, not to the point where they're not authentic. I still expect to hear the same facts, but I want to see them be able to influence people with very different perspectives. So if I come to the table in a post-interview debrief with my team and say, we're going to talk about candidate X, I want a diversity of perspectives and styles around that table. And if everybody says, yeah, they really resonated with me, now I know that they've adapted their communication style to be able to influence different perspectives. And that is a really powerful skill coming in.
Just really curious about building a team, because this might be one of the hardest decisions a lot of medical leaders are making is, would you rather have somebody who is experienced in medical affairs and you have to teach them because they've never done it before, process improvement, technology, support, training, or would you rather have a specialist who knows Vivo really deep or knows process improvement? Maybe they came from commercial, maybe they came from outside of industry, but they don't really understand medical affairs. Like, I find it really hard to find somebody who's an expert at both, who's not already got 20 years of experience doing this. Where do you start?
That's a great question. I think a lot of that is role dependent, whether the role is more functionally based, in which case you certainly want somebody who's comfortable with the tools, and the medical affairs background is less. A purely technical, for example, maybe field medical operations, if they're coming from commercial operations where the CRM system is the same and the organizational model is the same, maybe they don't need to know or could learn medical affairs, but I'd still want to see the capability and the curiosity for learning. They can't be in a bubble. Conversely, can I teach somebody the tools if they have a medical affairs expertise? Sure, with the caveat that they have to have an interest in it. And so many people aren't, but finding those who are medical affairs lifers, but are definitely interested in the nuts and bolts, they can truly be leaders because they already understand the mission of medical affairs. And that can be really, really big.
So if you found somebody, right, maybe they're a field medical leader or a senior executive MSL, maybe they're somewhere else in operations, and they have a real interest in expanding their influence within the organization from doing their job to helping others do theirs, what could somebody in medical affairs in one of those roles start doing today in the role to get good at the things that they were never taught officially, so that they would be effective hitting the ground running in medical excellence?
Fantastic question. What they can do today is make a connection with somebody in the organization who has that capability and is willing to be, if not a mentor, at least a regular point of contact, and get buy-in from your boss to say, hey, as part of my development plan, I'd like more exposure to operations because I think this would truly be a strength. And I want to meet one-on-one with this expert. We're going to talk about things. Eventually that may result in 20% of the work week being devoted to operations as part of one's development plan. And then you're feeding the group, right? You're feeding development of the organization. It works both ways. I've certainly had operations professionals come to me and say, I'm really interested in the commercial side of the organization, right? And to set them up with connections outside the function for their own development, because they very well might bring in tools and processes and ideas to you before they inevitably leave, which is fine because you're developing them, right? And we're all developers. We all need to replace ourselves. We all need to evolve the organization. That obviously gets lost often in the day-to-day, but it's something we all need to think about. And so to be able to leverage that interest in another function, whether it's somebody in your team looking outward, they can bring something back, whether it's somebody in another team looking at your team and saying, hey, I want to learn more. You might be able to help here. Let me connect you too. And then you might have your next project manager, your next MLR coordinator, you name it. And you've had to do much less work in recruitment and talent identification.
Absolutely. Wonderful. So we kind of talked a lot about the medical excellence and operations roles. Let's circle back to this idea of a chief of staff. How does a head of medical affairs know if that's something they need?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if I think about it, they may need a chief of staff. They may need a team. They may need it internally focused or externally focused, in which case thought to the branding, right? Should it be medical excellence or medical operations? It could be any one of those three. I think if a head of medical affairs or any officer, any C-suite officer or any leader of a substantially broad team, this doesn't just apply to medical. If a leader is finding themselves putting out fires nonstop and being unable to focus on what they were brought in to do, which is usually strategy, they probably need, in effect, an internal chief operating officer. And that's another way to think about a chief of staff or a head of operations is an internal right-hand person, a chief operating officer. If they want to, or if they need to delegate organizational building and maintaining activities, things like resource planning, interviewing, finance, strategic planning, if they really rather focus on strategy, or if those types of activities are weak spots and they need to bring in somebody to complement what they don't naturally do well, that can be a sign that an operations professional or team or chief of staff is really needed. I think if a leader has a vision that's set and is very clearly bought into and it makes sense to everybody, but the execution is lacking. You've got missed deadlines, you've got budget overruns, you've got activities that might be misaligned across functions. That screams for a form of chief operating officer to improve execution. And so I think those are some of the things that kind of raise flags for a leader to say, you know what, I need an operating officer on my team. I'm going to throw that back at you, Scott. You've seen innumerable operations groups, both small and large. Does that resonate with you? Are there others?
It does. Maybe a real concrete example of something that I look for is when somebody asks me the question, I ask them to open up their calendar. Right. And I go back 3 months and do a time audit with them. And what I find is that if a head of medical affairs, if the majority of their meetings are 30 minutes to an hour, and they have 0 4-hour blocks of actually being strategic and thinking and planning, they're spending their time on the wrong things, and they need somebody to help take all those little 30-minute execution tasks, as you talked about, kind of off of them so they can increase their 4-hour blocks to actually work on something, right? Otherwise, all week, they're just putting out the fires and they're connecting people and managing one-on-one and all of that stuff. And they never have time to go be strategic except for after dinner when they're trying to be with their kids.
That's a great tool, a time audit. That's fantastic, because I think I agree with that. How one manages their time is a really good proxy for, maybe not proxy, but a necessary component of effectiveness.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, most teams, even though they tell me budgets are tight and they tell me budgets are closed, they actually tend to have more budget than they do time. Right? So time is such a valuable resource to medical affairs leaders that if you show me your calendar, you're showing me what's important to you.
Mm-hmm.
And if what's important to you is running around putting out fires, not spending 4-hour chunks of blocks working on something that moves the business forward, you've just shown me what's important to you.
Absolutely.
So, Michael, I want to end by turning something back at you personally. So you personally, and this role, when it's done really well like you do, is an internal advisor. It's an expert for their organization. It's the role and the person that people turn to as a thought partner and a thought leader. Now, I'm seeing every year medical affairs teams become better. They're becoming more strategic. They're becoming more technical. They're becoming more execution oriented. And so for you to remain a valuable partner, you need to be getting better twice as fast as they are, or they won't need you anymore.
True.
So
Absolutely.
tell me what you are focused on for your own personal development. What should the medical excellence leader like you be spending their time on so that they become the leader that's still needed a year or two from now?
I spend my time in two areas predominantly. Number one is leading my team. My leadership style is largely mentorship driven. I spend a disproportionate amount of time when I have an opening on my team hiring. I am very, very careful when I hire because my ethos is hire really good people and stay out of their way. And so I'm fortunate, and some would say lucky, and I think there is a little bit of luck here, that the day-to-day issues that I see, those fires, are few and far between, and they're the escalated problems. My team is extraordinarily effective, and I'm really grateful because that gives me the time to do two things. Number one is develop them, think about where they need to grow, and helping them identify opportunities, preferably internally with my team or with medical affairs or even with the company, but if externally so need be. So constantly replenishing the system. That's number one. The other is looking outside the organization for ideas on how we can get better. And so I talk to a lot of technology partners and consulting partners and just pick their brains, not about their products necessarily. I always try and move the conversation to what are you seeing with your other clients? What challenges are you seeing? What solutions have you implemented? Because frankly, those are the ideas that I want to think about bringing in and implementing in my own team, the good ones, certainly, the ones that address a problem. I spent some time on my development with Medical Affairs Professional Society. I sit on the domain team within MAPS for business knowledge, and it's a really capable group of roughly half a dozen people, and we're developing from scratch a business curriculum for medical affairs professionals. So in connecting with this group, who are medical directors and operations professionals with a lot of different perspectives from large and small companies, I have access to an interesting network, and I'm seeing some interesting materials and bringing those things back. So looking externally and developing my team are the things that I put into those 4-hour blocks that you talk about. And that's really important. But I need to go back to what I started with, which is hire good people and stay out of their way, because you can't do that without an effective team if you're not putting out fires. So organizational design and having really good people on your team cannot be overstated.
Awesome. Well, Michael, thank you so much for sharing. Michael, you are so generous with your time. I don't know anybody I've ever met that hasn't found their conversations with you valuable. When you speak and you share at conferences, you don't do the superficial. You dive deep and say, you're going to be able to do something when I'm done here. And it's been fun co-presenting some of those with you over the years. If somebody wanted to connect with you and learn more about your role, your work, what you do for medical affairs organizations, what's the best way for somebody to get in touch with you?
Yeah, and I'm happy to connect with anybody on this topic. I would look forward to it. LinkedIn is certainly the best way. Would ask if it's possible for you to put the link to my profile up in the show notes.
Will do.
My name is Kahn. First name is Michael, and happy to connect on LinkedIn. It always helps, just a piece of advice to anybody, when you're doing a LinkedIn introduction or trying to make a connection, putting a personal note or where the area of overlap is always really helps. So if people would like to say, hey, I saw you on your podcast with Scott, I would love to connect with you about this topic, I will hit yes like that.
Absolutely love that, Michael. Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
For sure, Scott. Thank you.